On the day of my husband's funeral, I overheard my daughter-in-law on the phone. I cut her brake lines. Hopefully we'll have 2 funerals at once. The money will finally be ours. I went to the funeral as a passenger. When we arrived, I made an announcement that left her pale. But let me start from the beginning, because what happened that morning changed everything I thought I knew about my family.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
3 days. That's how long Robert had been gone when I woke up in our empty bedroom, staring at the black dress hanging on the closet door. The funeral director had been so kind, so patient with all the arrangements, but nothing could have prepared me for the hollow ache in my chest as I reached for that dress. I was 68 years old, and for the first time in 45 years of marriage, I was completely alone. The house felt different without Robert's presence. No morning coffee brewing downstairs, no rustling of newspaper pages, no gentle humming as he tended to his rose garden, just silence that seemed to press against my eardrums until I thought I might scream. I made my way downstairs, each step echoing in the quiet hallway. Robert's reading glasses were still on the kitchen table, folded next to yesterday's unfinished crossword puzzle. My throat tightened as I moved them to the drawer, unable to throw them away, but unable to look at them either. The funeral was scheduled for 2 p.m. I had 3 hours to pull myself together, to be the dignified widow everyone expected me to be. 3 hours to somehow find the strength to say goodbye to the man who had been my whole world. I was pouring coffee when I heard Jessica's voice drifting from the living room. My daughter-in-law had arrived early, ostensibly to help me get ready, though she'd been more interested in going through Robert's study than offering comfort. I assumed she was making arrangements with the caterer or calling relatives, so I didn't pay much attention at first. But something in her tone made me pause, coffee pot suspended in midair. "No, it didn't work," Jessica was saying, her voice low but carrying that sharp edge I'd learned to recognize over the past 5 years. "The old lady is still breathing, unfortunately." My hand froze. Old lady? Was she talking about me? I set the coffee pot down as quietly as I could, my heart beginning to pound in my chest. Moving closer to the kitchen doorway, I strained to hear more. "I cut her brake lines yesterday while she was at the viewing," Jessica continued, and ice-cold shock ran through my entire body. I figured she'd drive herself to the funeral today and, well, problem solved. 2 funerals instead of 1, and we'd finally get what's rightfully ours. The world tilted sideways. I gripped the doorframe to steady myself, certain I must have misheard. This couldn't be real. Jessica was talking about killing me. My own daughter-in-law, the mother of my grandchildren, had tried to murder me. "But the stupid woman is probably too emotional to drive," Jessica went on, her voice dripping with disgust. "I'll have to offer her a ride and figure out something else later. The will reading is next week, and I can't risk her making any changes before then." My legs threatened to give out beneath me. Robert's will. Of course. We'd never hidden the fact that we were comfortable financially. Robert's construction business had done well over the years, and we'd been careful with our investments. But I never imagined that money would make me a target for murder. "Don't worry," Jessica was saying. "I've been planning this for months. The grieving daughter-in-law will be so devastated if something happens to poor Helen. Who would suspect me?" The casual way she said my name, as if discussing the weather instead of my death, made my stomach lurch. I pressed my hand to my mouth to stifle a gasp. "She's always been accident-prone anyway," Jessica continued with a laugh that chilled me to the bone. "Remember when she fell down those stairs last Christmas? Or when she got food poisoning from that casserole I brought over? People already think she's just a clumsy old woman." Those incidents hadn't been accidents. The pieces began clicking together in my mind with horrible clarity. The loose handrail that Robert had sworn he'd tightened just days before. The violent illness that had kept me bedridden for a week. How many times had Jessica tried to hurt me without my realizing it? "I have to go," Jessica said suddenly. "She's probably wondering where I am. Time to play the devoted daughter-in-law one last time." I heard her footsteps approaching and quickly moved away from the doorway, my hands shaking as I grabbed my coffee cup and pretended to be busy at the counter. "Helen?" Jessica's voice was sweet now, concerned. "How are you holding up, sweetheart?" I turned to face her, somehow managing to keep my expression neutral despite the terror coursing through my veins. Jessica stood in the kitchen doorway wearing a perfectly pressed black dress and an expression of practiced sympathy. Her blonde hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, and her makeup was flawless. She looked like the picture of a grieving daughter-in-law. But now I could see what I'd missed before. The coldness in her blue eyes that never quite matched her warm smile. The way her concern seemed rehearsed, like lines she'd memorized for a play. "I'm managing," I said, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "Just trying to get through today." "Of course," Jessica said, moving closer. "Robert would want you to be strong. He was so proud of how independent you've always been." Independent. The word felt like a mockery now. Had she been studying me all these years, learning my habits, planning the best way to eliminate me? "I was thinking," Jessica continued, "maybe I should drive you to the funeral today. You shouldn't have to worry about driving when you're so emotional." There it was, the trap she'd laid for me, disguised as kindness. If I hadn't overheard that phone call, I would have been grateful for her offer. I might have insisted on taking my own car, and then, "That's very thoughtful of you," I managed to say, "but I can drive myself. I need the time alone to collect my thoughts." Jessica's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Helen, I really don't think that's a good idea. You're grieving, you're upset. What if something happened? Something like my brakes failing on the way to bury my husband?" I wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, to ask how she could stand there pretending to care about my safety when she'd spent the morning talking about my death. But some instinct for survival kept me quiet. Jessica didn't know I'd overheard her. That gave me an advantage, perhaps the only one I had. "You're probably right," I said finally. "I am feeling a bit shaky today." Relief flashed across Jessica's features. "Good, I'll drive, and you can just focus on saying goodbye to Robert." As I looked at my daughter-in-law, this woman who had sat at my dinner table countless times, who had smiled and laughed and played with her children in my backyard, I felt something inside me harden. She wanted me dead. She had tried to kill me. And if I got in that car with her, I had no doubt she would try again. But I also realized something else. Jessica had made a critical mistake. She thought she was so clever, so careful in her planning, but she'd underestimated me completely. I was about to show her exactly how wrong she was. "I'll just go get my purse," I said, turning away before she could see the determination that was surely written across my face, because Jessica was right about one thing. There would indeed be an announcement at Robert's funeral today, just not the kind she was expecting. The walk to my bedroom felt like the longest journey of my life. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely grip the banister as I climbed the stairs. Jessica's words kept echoing in my mind. I cut her brake lines. The casual way she'd said it, like discussing what to serve for lunch, made my stomach turn. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my reflection in the vanity mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed older somehow, her gray hair disheveled, her hazel eyes wide with shock. 3 days ago, I'd been a grieving widow. Now I was apparently a murder target. I needed to think clearly. Jessica expected me to drive to the funeral and die in a car accident. When that didn't happen, she'd offered to drive me herself. She was improvising now, but that made her even more dangerous. What would she do when we were alone in her car? My purse sat on the dresser, and I reached for it with shaking hands. Inside was my cell phone, but who could I call? The police? And tell them what? That I'd overheard my daughter-in-law talking about cutting my brake lines? They'd want to see evidence, and I'd have to explain why I hadn't called immediately. Besides, Jessica was smart. She'd chosen her timing perfectly. On the day of Robert's funeral, when I was supposedly too distraught to think clearly, who would believe that she'd tried to kill me? I thought about my son Michael, Jessica's husband. He was already at the funeral home, greeting relatives and making last-minute arrangements. Michael had always been a good son, but he adored Jessica. She'd had 5 years to work on him, to present herself as the perfect wife and mother. If I called him now, claiming his wife was trying to murder me, would he believe it? Probably not, especially not today. when emotions were running high and I could easily be dismissed as a hysterical old woman who was lashing out in grief. No, I realized. I was completely on my own. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Jessica thought she was so clever, offering to drive me to my husband's funeral. She probably imagined herself as the grieving daughter-in-law who'd tried so hard to help, only to be tragically unable to prevent my accident. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She didn't know that I knew. I stood up slowly, my mind beginning to clear. If Jessica wanted to play this game, then I'd play it, but I'd play to win. I walked to my closet and pulled out a small digital recorder that Robert had given me years ago for recording grocery lists and reminders. It was tiny, barely bigger than a matchbox, and I'd forgotten I even had it until now. I slipped it into my purse, along with my phone set to record. Then I went to Robert's side of the closet and found what I was looking for, the spare key to our car. Jessica might have sabotaged my brakes, but she couldn't know about this spare key that Robert kept hidden in an old shoebox. I had an idea forming, dangerous and desperate, but it might be my only chance. The sound of Jessica calling my name from downstairs made me jump. "Helen, are you almost ready? We should leave soon." "Coming," I called back, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. I took one last look around the bedroom I'd shared with Robert for so many years. The photos on the nightstand showed our life together, our wedding day, Michael's graduation, family vacations, grandchildren's birthdays, a lifetime of memories that Jessica wanted to erase for money. Well, she was about to learn that this old woman wasn't as helpless as she thought. I found Jessica waiting by the front door, checking her watch with barely concealed impatience. She'd put on her coat and was holding her car keys, every inch the concerned daughter-in-law ready to support her grieving mother-in-law. "There you are," she said with that practiced smile. I was starting to worry. "Sorry, I couldn't find my good purse," I lied smoothly. "You know how it is." Jessica's laugh sounded forced. "Of course. Are you sure you have everything? We won't be able to come back." The way she said it sent chills down my spine. She really didn't expect me to survive this trip. "I think so," I said, patting my purse. "Just my tissues and some mints." We walked to her car together, Jessica chattering nervously about the weather and how many people she expected at the service. I made appropriate responses, but my mind was racing. I needed to be smart about this. One wrong move, and I could end up dead in a ditch somewhere, with Jessica playing the devastated witness to my tragic accident. As we reached her silver sedan, Jessica moved to the driver's side. "Are you comfortable in the passenger seat? I can adjust it for you." "That's fine, dear," I said, climbing in. The leather seat smelled of her expensive perfume, and I noticed how spotlessly clean everything was. She'd prepared for this. Jessica started the car and pulled out of my driveway. As we passed my garage, I could see my own car sitting there, looking perfectly normal from the outside. But somewhere underneath, the brake lines had been severed, turning my reliable Honda into a death trap. "It's such a beautiful day for a funeral," Jessica said as we drove through town. Robert would have loved this sunshine. I wanted to scream at her hypocrisy, but instead I nodded. He always said he wanted to be remembered on a bright day. "He was such a wonderful man," Jessica continued. "So generous, so trusting. He saw the best in everyone." The emphasis on trusting felt deliberate, like a jab. Had Robert suspected something? Had Jessica been planning this even while he was alive? As we stopped at a red light, Jessica glanced over at me. "Helen, I hope you know how much Robert loved you. He used to tell me all the time how proud he was of the life you'd built together." "Did he?" I managed to ask. "Oh yes, he was especially proud of how well you'd managed your finances over the years. That nest egg you two built up. He said it would ensure you'd never have to worry about anything." There it was, the money. Jessica was practically salivating as she talked about it. She probably knew exactly how much Robert and I had saved, down to the last penny. "We were fortunate," I said carefully. "More than fortunate," Jessica said, her voice taking on an edge. "Robert told me the house alone is worth almost $500,000, and that's not even counting the investments and savings accounts." My blood ran cold. Robert would never have discussed our finances with Jessica in such detail, which meant she'd been snooping, probably for years, going through our papers, maybe even our computer files. "I suppose," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. Jessica smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Well, you don't need to worry about any of that today. Today is about saying goodbye to Robert. We pulled into the parking lot of Morrison Funeral Home, and I saw cars already gathering, family members, friends, colleagues from Robert's construction business, people who had genuinely cared about my husband, and here I was, arriving with the woman who wanted me dead. Jessica parked near the entrance and turned off the engine. For a moment, we sat in silence, and I could feel her watching me. "Helen," she said finally, her voice softer now, "I want you to know that no matter what happens, Michael and I will take care of you. You'll never have to worry about being alone." The words were meant to be comforting, but they sounded like a threat. Take care of me indeed. Just like she'd tried to take care of me this morning. I turned to look at her, this woman who had fooled my family for 5 years. "That's very kind of you, Jessica. I appreciate that." She smiled and squeezed my hand. "We're family, Helen. Family takes care of each other." As we walked toward the funeral home entrance, Jessica's arm linked through mine in a show of support. I made a silent promise to my dead husband. Before this day was over, everyone would know exactly what kind of woman Jessica really was. She thought she'd trapped me, but she was about to learn that sometimes the prey is more dangerous than the predator. The funeral was about to begin, and I had an announcement to make. Walking into Morrison Funeral Home felt like entering a different world. The soft lighting, hushed voices, and scent of lilies created an atmosphere of reverence that should have been comforting. Instead, with Jessica's arm still linked through mine, it felt like walking into my own wake. The main viewing room was already half full. I recognized faces from Robert's construction company, neighbors we'd known for decades, relatives who'd driven hours to pay their respects. Seeing them all gathered to honor my husband should have filled me with warmth, but all I could think about was Jessica's voice on the phone. 2 funerals instead of 1. "Look at all these people," Jessica murmured beside me, her voice perfectly pitched for the grieving daughter-in-law role. Robert was so loved. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My throat felt tight, and not just from grief. Every time Jessica spoke, I heard the echo of her real voice, the cold calculation as she discussed my murder. Michael appeared at my side, his face drawn with exhaustion. My son looked older than his 43 years today, his dark hair showing more gray than I'd noticed before. He wrapped me in a gentle hug, and for a moment, I felt safe. "Mom, how are you holding up?" he asked, studying my face with concern. "I'm managing," I said, meaning it more than he could know. Jessica immediately moved closer, inserting herself into our conversation. "She's been so brave, Michael. I've been worried about her all morning." Michael smiled gratefully at his wife. "Thank you for taking care of her, Jess. I don't know what we'd do without you." The irony was so thick I could taste it. If Jessica had her way, they wouldn't have to worry about doing anything without her much longer. I'd be dead, and she'd be the grieving daughter-in-law who'd tried so hard to help. "Mrs. Patterson?" A voice behind me made me turn. It was Tom Martinez, Robert's business partner for over 20 years. His weathered face was creased with genuine sorrow. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Robert was one of the finest men I ever knew." "Thank you, Tom," I said, accepting his handshake. "He spoke of you often." "We're going to miss him at the job sites," Tom continued. "He had this way of making everyone feel valued, you know, even the newest apprentice." As Tom spoke about Robert's kindness and integrity, I found myself really looking at the people around me. These were Robert's friends, his colleagues, people who had known him for decades. They were here because they genuinely cared, because my husband had touched their lives in meaningful ways. And Jessica wanted to eliminate me for money. "Helen, dear," I turned to find my sister Margaret approaching, her eyes red from crying. She'd driven down from Syracuse that morning, leaving her own family to be here for me. "Margaret," I breathed, accepting her embrace. For the first time since discovering Jessica's plan, I felt tears threatening. Margaret had been there for every major moment of my life. She'd been my maid of honor, had helped me through difficult times, had celebrated my joys. "I'm so sorry I couldn't get here sooner," Margaret whispered. "How are you really doing? And don't give me any polite answers." I glanced around, noting that Jessica was momentarily distracted talking to someone from the church. "It's been difficult," I said carefully. "Some things have come to light that I never expected." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. She'd always been perceptive, able to read between my lines even when we were children. What kind of things? Before I could answer, Jessica was back at my side, her radar apparently finely tuned to any conversation that didn't include her. "Margaret, how wonderful that you could make it," Jessica said with that practiced warmth. "I know how much it means to Helen to have family here." "Of course," Margaret replied, but I caught the slight coolness in her tone. My sister had never particularly warmed to Jessica, though she'd been too polite to say anything directly. "Jessica has been such a help today," I said, watching my daughter-in-law's reaction. "She even insisted on driving me here, said she was worried about me being on the road." "How thoughtful," Margaret said, but her eyes sharpened as she looked at Jessica. "Though Helen's always been an excellent driver, I can't remember the last time she had any kind of car trouble." Jessica's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well, grief can affect us in unexpected ways. It's better to be safe." As the conversation continued, I began to notice things I'd missed before, the way Jessica always positioned herself to control the flow of discussion, how she subtly redirected attention away from topics that might lead to questions she didn't want to answer, the practiced responses that sounded genuine but felt rehearsed upon closer examination. Had she been managing me this way for years? The thought was disturbing, but as I reflected on our interactions over the past 5 years, patterns began to emerge. Family gatherings where Jessica would suggest activities that conveniently excluded me. Conversations about family finances that would suddenly shift when I entered the room. The gradual way certain relatives had stopped calling after Jessica mentioned they seemed tired or busy when I wasn't around to contradict her. "Helen?" Tom Martinez had returned, and this time he looked troubled. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Jessica immediately stepped closer. "Is everything all right? If there's something about the business, I'm sure Michael should be involved." "Actually," Tom said firmly, "this is something I need to discuss with Helen directly." It was Robert's specific request. Jessica's jaw tightened, but she couldn't argue with that. I followed Tom to a quieter corner of the room, my heart pounding. What had Robert told him? "Mrs. Patterson," Tom began, lowering his voice. "Robert came to see me about 3 weeks ago. He seemed concerned about something. He asked me to give you this if anything happened to him." Tom handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Robert's familiar handwriting. My hands shook as I took it, and I noticed Tom glancing around nervously. "He said to tell you that if you ever felt unsafe, or if anything seemed wrong after he was gone, you should call me immediately, day or night." Tom pressed a business card into my hand along with the envelope. "He was very specific about that, Helen. Very specific." My throat constricted. Robert had known something was wrong. He'd sensed the danger I was in, even if he hadn't understood the full extent of it. "Did he say anything else?" I whispered. Tom hesitated. "He mentioned that he'd been having some health issues that didn't quite add up, said his medications weren't working the way they should, and his doctor couldn't explain why. He wondered if—" Tom trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "If what?" I pressed. "If someone might be interfering with his treatment somehow." I told him that sounded paranoid, but he said he'd lived long enough to trust his instincts. Ice flooded my veins. Jessica's words from that morning echoed in my mind. Remember when she got food poisoning from that casserole I brought over? If she'd been poisoning me, had she been doing the same to Robert? "Tom," I said urgently, "I need you to know that what Robert suspected might have been true. I can't explain everything right now, but I may need your help later today." Tom's weathered face grew serious. "What kind of help?" Before I could answer, Jessica appeared at my elbow again, her timing suspiciously perfect. "Helen, they're asking everyone to take their seats. The service is about to begin." Her eyes flicked between Tom and me, clearly trying to assess what we'd been discussing. "Of course," I said, slipping the envelope and Tom's card into my purse. "Thank you, Tom, for everything." As we moved toward the seating area, I caught Margaret watching the interaction with a puzzled expression. She'd always been good at reading situations, and I could see her mind working, trying to piece together what she was observing. The funeral director, a dignified man named Mr. Morrison, gestured for immediate family to take the front row. Michael guided me to my seat, with Jessica settling beside him. I found myself sandwiched between my grieving son and the woman who wanted me dead. The irony was almost overwhelming. Here we were, preparing to honor Robert's memory, while his daughter-in-law sat planning how to join me to him in death. As the service began, I clutched my purse tighter, feeling the envelope Robert had left for me. Whatever was inside might hold the key to understanding just how long Jessica had been planning this and how far she was willing to go. The minister began speaking about Robert's life, his accomplishments, his love for his family. I should have been focused on honoring my husband's memory, but instead I found myself studying the people around me with new eyes. Margaret, sitting directly behind me, kept glancing at Jessica with an expression I couldn't quite read. Tom Martinez, 3 rows back, was watching me with obvious concern. Michael, beside me, held his wife's hand while tears rolled down his cheeks, completely oblivious to the truth about the woman he loved. And Jessica sat there, the picture of a grieving daughter-in-law, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, playing her role perfectly. But I wasn't fooled anymore. I could see her for what she really was. A predator who had infiltrated my family and was systematically destroying it from within. The minister was talking about the importance of family, about how love transcends death, about the bonds that tie us together across generations. Beautiful words that felt like mockery coming from someone who didn't know that one family member was actively trying to murder another. As the service continued, I made my plans. I would wait until the eulogies began, when there would be a microphone available, and everyone's attention would be focused on the speaker. Then I would stand up and tell everyone exactly what Jessica had said that morning. Let her try to explain away cutting my break lines in front of a room full of witnesses. The thought of confronting her publicly should have terrified me, but instead, I felt a growing sense of determination. Robert had tried to warn me, had left me that envelope with Tom, had suspected something was wrong before he died. Now it was up to me to finish what he'd started. Jessica leaned over and whispered, "Are you holding up okay, Helen? You look a little flushed." I turned to meet her eyes directly. "I'm fine, dear. Just thinking about everything Robert meant to all of us." Something flickered in Jessica's expression, as if she was trying to read some hidden meaning in my words. Good. Let her wonder. Let her worry. Because in a few minutes, her carefully constructed facade was going to crumble in front of everyone who mattered. The minister was finishing his prepared remarks now, preparing to invite family members to share their memories of Robert. This was it. This was my moment. I reached into my purse and felt for the small recorder, making sure it was ready. Then I stood up slowly, my legs steadier than they'd been all day. Everyone's attention turned to me, including Jessica's. I could see the confusion in her eyes, the beginning of alarm as she realized I was going off script. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "I'd like to say something about my husband, and about some things that have come to light since his death." The room fell completely silent. Jessica's face had gone pale, and I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out what I was about to reveal. She was about to find out that this old lady wasn't nearly as helpless as she'd thought. Standing in front of that room full of mourners, looking down at Jessica's increasingly pale face, I felt a surge of power I hadn't experienced in years. But I also realized that I needed to be smart about this. One wrong move, one statement I couldn't prove, and Jessica could turn this around on me. She could paint me as a grieving widow having a breakdown, lashing out at innocent family members. "I'd like to share some memories of Robert," I said carefully, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "And I want to talk about the kind of man he was, because I think his character tells us something important about how we should treat the people we love." I saw Jessica's shoulders relax slightly. She thought I was just going to give a typical eulogy. She had no idea what was coming. "Robert was always protective of the people he cared about," I continued, reaching into my purse and pulling out the envelope Tom had given me. "Even in his final weeks when he wasn't feeling well, he was worried about my safety. He left me this letter with his business partner, Tom Martinez, with instructions to give it to me if anything happened to him." The room was completely silent now. Even the funeral director had stopped moving, sensing that something significant was unfolding. "Tom," I called out, "would you please come forward?" Tom rose from his seat, his weathered face serious as he made his way to the front of the room. Jessica was watching him with barely concealed panic, and I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out what Robert might have told him. "Tom," I said when he reached me, "could you please tell everyone what Robert said when he gave you this envelope?" Tom cleared his throat, glancing around the room before speaking. "Robert came to see me about 3 weeks ago. He seemed worried about something. He said he'd been having health problems that his doctors couldn't explain, and he was concerned about Helen's safety after he was gone." A murmur ran through the gathered mourners. This wasn't the typical funeral eulogy they'd been expecting. "He asked me to give Helen this envelope if anything happened to him," Tom continued. "And he told me that if Helen ever felt unsafe, or if anything seemed wrong, she should call me immediately." "Thank you, Tom," I said, then turned back to address the room. "I'm going to read you what my husband wrote, because I think it's important that everyone here understands what kind of danger he sensed." With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Robert's handwriting was shakier than usual, evidence of how ill he'd been in those final weeks. "My dearest Helen," I read aloud, "if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true and I'm no longer here to protect you. I've been suspecting for months that someone close to us has been making me sicker than I should be. My medications don't seem to work right, and I've had symptoms that don't match what my doctors expect." The room was so quiet, I could hear people breathing. Jessica had gone completely white, her hands clutched together in her lap. "I'm worried that the same person might try to hurt you," I continued reading. "Please be careful, especially around anyone who has access to our house and our personal belongings. Trust your instincts, and don't hesitate to call Tom if you feel threatened. I love you more than words can say, and I pray that I'm wrong about all of this. But if I'm not, please don't let them get away with it. Your loving husband, Robert." I folded the letter carefully and looked up at the stunned faces around me. This morning, I discovered that Robert's fears were completely justified. Jessica suddenly stood up, her voice sharp with panic. "Helen, you're obviously distraught. This isn't the place for wild accusations. Robert was sick. He was paranoid in his final days." "Sit down, Jessica," I said firmly. "I'm not finished." The authority in my voice seemed to surprise her, and she sank back into her chair, but I could see her looking around the room, probably calculating her chances of making it to the exit. "This morning," I continued, "I overheard a phone conversation that explained everything. Someone in this room cut the brake lines on my car, hoping I would die in an accident on the way to this funeral." Gasps echoed through the room. Michael shot to his feet, his face a mask of confusion and horror. "Mom, what are you talking about? Who would do such a thing?" Before I could answer, Margaret's voice cut through the air from behind me. "Helen, is that why you look so shaken? Is that why Jessica was so insistent on driving you here?" I turned to face my sister, seeing the understanding dawning in her eyes. "Yes, Margaret. Because the person who cut my brake lines is sitting right here in the front row." Michael's head swiveled toward Jessica, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "What? No, that's impossible. Jess would never—" "Tell them, Jessica," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room. "Tell them what you said on the phone this morning about cutting my brake lines. Tell them how you hoped we'd have 2 funerals at once so the money would finally be yours." Jessica's face had gone from white to red, her composure completely shattered. "You're having a breakdown, Helen. You're imagining things because you're grieving." "Am I?" I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, because I recorded our entire conversation in the car on the way here. "Would you like me to play it for everyone?" It was a bluff. I hadn't recorded anything in the car, had been too terrified to think clearly. But Jessica didn't know that, and the panic in her eyes told me she was remembering every incriminating thing she'd said during that drive. "Helen," Michael said, his voice breaking, "please tell me this isn't true. Please tell me my wife didn't try to kill you." The pain in my son's voice nearly broke my heart, but I pressed on. "Michael, I'm sorry you have to learn about this here, but I couldn't risk waiting. After what I heard this morning, I don't know what Jessica might try next." Tom stepped forward again. "There's something else," he said grimly. "After Robert gave me that envelope, I started thinking about what he'd said. So I did some checking with his doctors. They'd been puzzled by some of his symptoms. especially how certain medications seemed to stop working for him. "What kind of symptoms?" Dr. Harrison called out from the middle of the room. He'd been Robert's physician for over a decade. "Unusual bleeding, problems with blood clotting, symptoms that suggested his blood thinners were being interfered with somehow," Tom replied. Dr. Harrison's face went ashen. "That's impossible unless someone was giving him additional blood thinners or something that enhanced their effects." All eyes turned to Jessica, who looked like a trapped animal. She stood up suddenly, her voice rising to a near shriek. "This is insane! You're all crazy! Helen, you're a bitter old woman who can't stand that your son loves someone else more than you." "Then explain the brake lines," I said calmly. "If I'm just a crazy old woman having delusions, why don't we go look at my car right now? I'm sure the damage would be pretty obvious to anyone who knows what to look for." Margaret stood up from her seat behind me. "I'll go look at it myself. I may be a retired teacher, but I grew up around cars. Dad made sure all his daughters knew basic mechanics. And I'll go with her," Tom added. "I've been working on cars since I was 16. Jessica's eyes darted around the room, looking for support, for someone who might believe her version of events. But the faces staring back at her were filled with shock, disgust, and growing anger. "Michael," she said desperately, reaching for her husband, "you know me. You know I would never hurt anyone. Your mother is just trying to drive us apart because she's always been jealous of our marriage." Michael stepped away from her reaching hands, his face a mask of horror and betrayal. "Jess, if what Mom is saying is true, if you really tried to kill her—" "It's not true!" Jessica screamed. "None of it's true. She's making it all up because she wants to keep all of Robert's money for herself." The mention of money sent another wave of shocked murmurs through the room. People were beginning to understand the motive behind Jessica's actions. "Speaking of money," I said, reaching into my purse again, "I think everyone should know that Jessica has been very interested in our financial situation for quite some time." I pulled out a folder I'd grabbed from Robert's desk that morning while Jessica was on the phone. "These are copies of statements from our bank accounts, investment portfolios, and insurance policies. You'll notice that someone has been through them recently, making notes in the margins about values and beneficiaries." I opened the folder and showed the pages to the room. Even from a distance, people could see the handwritten notes in the margins, notes that were clearly in Jessica's distinctive script. "Those calculations show exactly how much Jessica thought she and Michael would inherit," I continued. "But there's one thing she didn't know. Robert and I revised our wills 6 months ago." Jessica's face went completely white. "What do you mean?" "I mean that after we noticed some things going missing from the house, after Robert started getting sicker in ways that didn't make sense, we decided to be more careful about who we trusted," I said. "Our new wills specify that if either of us dies under suspicious circumstances, everything goes to charity instead of to family members." The silence in the room was deafening. Jessica stared at me with naked hatred, all pretense of grief or concern finally stripped away. "You think you're so smart," she hissed, "but you have no proof of anything. It's all just paranoid delusions from a bitter old woman and her dead husband." "Actually," a new voice said from the back of the room, "we have plenty of proof now." I turned to see 2 police officers entering the funeral home, followed by a man in a suit who was clearly a detective. "Detective Williams," the lead officer announced. "We received a call about an attempted murder. We're going to need to examine Mrs. Patterson's vehicle immediately." Jessica's face crumpled as she realized her situation was hopeless. She looked around the room one last time, seeing nothing but shocked and disgusted faces staring back at her. "This isn't over," she said to me, her voice filled with venom. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what I'm capable of." "Actually," I said calmly, "I think I have a very good idea. And I think everyone else here does too now." As the police moved to arrest Jessica, Michael collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands. The sound of his sobbing broke my heart, but I knew I'd done the right thing. My son would heal from this betrayal, but he couldn't heal if he was dead, and I had no doubt that once Jessica had eliminated me, she would have found a way to get rid of Michael too. After all, why share the inheritance when you could have it all? The funeral I'd expected to be about saying goodbye to my beloved husband had become something else entirely. It had become the day I saved my own life and exposed a killer who had been hiding in plain sight. As they led Jessica away in handcuffs, she turned back to look at me one last time. The mask had completely fallen away now, and I could see the cold calculation in her eyes that I'd missed for so many years. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I'd faced down my would-be killer and won. Now it was time to truly begin grieving for Robert and to help my son heal from the betrayal of the woman he'd loved and trusted. The real funeral could finally begin. The handcuffs clicking around Jessica's wrists seemed to echo through the stunned silence of the funeral home. As Detective Williams read her rights, I watched my daughter-in-law's face cycle through emotions, rage, desperation, and finally, a cold calculation that chilled me to the bone. "You have the right to remain silent," the detective continued, his voice professional but firm. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Jessica's eyes never left mine as he spoke. Even in custody, even with her carefully constructed facade completely destroyed, she was still trying to intimidate me. The woman I'd thought I knew for 5 years had been a complete stranger, and the real Jessica was terrifying in her lack of remorse. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said to the detective, her voice taking on that sweet, reasonable tone she'd perfected over the years. "I'm a grieving daughter-in-law dealing with a mother-in-law who's clearly having a mental breakdown. She's making wild accusations because she can't handle her grief." Detective Williams glanced at me, then back at Jessica. "Ma'am, we've already examined Mrs. Patterson's vehicle. The brake lines were indeed severed with what appears to be bolt cutters. This is a very serious matter." The color drained from Jessica's face as she realized her first line of defense had just crumbled. Of course the police had found the damage. She'd been so confident in her plan, so certain I'd be dead before anyone thought to look at my car. "I want a lawyer," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's your right," Detective Williams replied, "but I should inform you that we also have a search warrant for your home and vehicle. We'll be looking for tools, evidence of planning, and any substances that might explain Mr. Patterson's unusual medical symptoms before his death." Jessica's composure finally shattered completely. "You can't do this to me. I have children. I'm a mother." The irony of her words hit me like a physical blow. She was crying about her children while she'd been trying to rob mine of his mother. The selfishness was breathtaking in its scope. Michael finally looked up from where he'd been sitting with his head in his hands. His face was ravaged with grief and shock, and when he spoke, his voice was barely recognizable. "Jess," he said quietly, "just tell me one thing. Is it true? Did you really try to kill my mother?" For a moment, Jessica's mask slipped back into place. She looked at her husband with those wide, innocent eyes that had fooled us all for so long. "Michael, honey, you know me. You know I would never hurt anyone. Your mother is confused. She's grieving. She's not thinking clearly." But Michael wasn't buying it anymore. The evidence was too overwhelming, the circumstances too clear. "The brake lines, Jess. They didn't cut themselves." Jessica's eyes darted around the room, looking for any ally, any sympathetic face. She found none. Even the funeral director looked horrified by what had unfolded in his establishment. "I was trying to protect our family," she said finally, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "Your mother was going to change the will. She was going to leave everything to charity out of spite. Our children would have had nothing." The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. She'd just confessed to attempted murder in front of a room full of witnesses. Michael stood up slowly, his face a mask of disgust and betrayal. "So you decided to kill her? You decided to murder my mother for money? It wasn't supposed to happen this way," Jessica said, her voice rising to a near shriek. "She was supposed to die quickly, peacefully. It would have looked like an accident. No one would have been hurt except her, and she's old anyway. She's lived her life." The callousness of her words sent a wave of shocked gasps through the room. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. This was cold, calculated murder, motivated by pure greed. Margaret stood up from her seat behind me, her teacher's voice cutting through the chaos with authority. "Young lady, I've heard enough. Take her away before she says something even more disgusting." Detective Williams nodded to his officers, who began escorting Jessica toward the exit, but she wasn't done yet. As they reached the door, she turned back one last time, her face twisted with hatred. "You think you've won, Helen, but you haven't," she spat. I'll get out of this, and when I do, I'll finish what I started. You can't watch your back forever. The threat sent ice through my veins, but I kept my voice steady. I think you'll find that threatening to kill someone in front of police officers isn't the best legal strategy, dear. Detective Williams made a note in his pad. Threat made in front of multiple witnesses. We'll add that to the charges. As they finally led Jessica away, the funeral home fell into an uncomfortable silence. Nearly 50 people had just witnessed a murder confession and arrest at what was supposed to be a solemn memorial service for my husband. Mr. Morrison, the funeral director, approached me cautiously. Mrs. Patterson, I'm so sorry this happened here. Would you like us to postpone the service? I understand this has been traumatic for everyone. I looked around the room at the faces of Robert's friends and family. They looked shell-shocked, confused, and deeply saddened. But they'd come here to honor my husband's memory, and I wasn't going to let Jessica's evil actions rob them of that opportunity. No, I said firmly. We're here to celebrate Robert's life, and that's exactly what we're going to do. He would want us to focus on love and family, not on the actions of someone who never truly understood what those words mean. Tom Martinez stepped forward, his weathered face etched with concern. Helen, are you sure you're up for this? It's been a hell of a shock. I thought about that for a moment. Was I up for it? An hour ago, I'd been a terrified widow who'd discovered her daughter-in-law was trying to kill her. Now, Jessica was in custody, her threats were empty, and I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about Robert and me. I'm more ready than I've been all day, I said, and I realized it was true. The fear that had been eating at me since that morning was gone. Jessica could never hurt me or anyone else again. Dr. Harrison approached, still looking shaken by the revelation about Robert's medical symptoms. Helen, I need to apologize. If someone was interfering with Robert's medications, if I missed signs of poisoning, don't, I said firmly. You treated Robert based on the information you had. None of us suspected that someone was deliberately making him sicker. Still, Dr. Harrison continued, I should have been more thorough when his symptoms didn't match his diagnoses. I should have considered the possibility of deliberate interference. Margaret put her hand on the doctor's shoulder. We all should have seen signs we missed. That woman was very good at what she did. She fooled everyone. Michael still hadn't moved from his seat in the front row. He sat staring at his hands, occasionally shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. I sat down beside him and took his hand in mine. Michael, I'm so sorry you had to learn about this here. Like this. He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. Mom, how long have you known? How long have you suspected? Only since this morning, I said honestly. I overheard her on the phone confessing to cutting my brake lines. Until then, I had no idea. But Dad suspected something, Michael said, his voice hollow. That letter he left with Tom. He knew she was dangerous. I nodded. Your father was always protective of the people he loved. Even when he was sick, even when he was dying, he was trying to keep me safe. Michael's face crumpled. I brought her into our family. I married her. I had children with her. How could I have been so blind? Because you loved her, I said simply. Because you trusted her. Because she was very, very good at hiding who she really was. Margaret leaned forward from the seat behind us. Michael, honey, predators like Jessica are experts at deception. They study their targets, they learn what we want to see, and they become exactly that person. It's not your fault. Tom Martinez nodded grimly. I've seen it before in business deals. People who seem perfect on the surface, who say all the right things, but underneath they're calculating how to take advantage of your trust. The conversation was interrupted by Detective Williams returning to the room. Mrs. Patterson, I need to ask you a few more questions for our report. The brake line damage is extensive and deliberate. This was definitely attempted murder. As I answered the detective's questions, providing details about the phone conversation I'd overheard and the suspicious incidents from the past, I felt a strange sense of relief washing over me. The truth was finally out. The danger was over. Justice was being served. We'll need you to come to the station later to give a formal statement, Detective Williams said. But for now, I think you've been through enough today. After the detective left, I looked around the room at the people who remained. Despite everything that had happened, most of Robert's friends and family had stayed. They'd come to honor him, and they weren't going to let Jessica's actions change that. Mr. Morrison approached again. "Mrs. Patterson, if you're ready, we can continue with the service. I'll keep it brief, given the circumstances." I stood up slowly, feeling decades older than I had that morning, but also somehow stronger. "Thank you. I think Robert would want us to remember him properly." As the service resumed, I found myself really listening to the words being spoken about my husband, stories of his kindness, his integrity, his dedication to his family and friends. The man being remembered was nothing like the woman who had tried to destroy us both. When it came time for final remarks, I stood up once more. But this time, instead of exposing a killer, I was honoring the memory of the man I'd loved for 45 years. "Robert would be heartbroken by what happened here today," I began, my voice steady despite the emotional upheaval. "Not because justice was served, but because he would hate knowing that someone he welcomed into our family was capable of such evil." I paused, looking around the room at the faces watching me. But Robert would also be proud that we didn't let fear silence the truth. He would be glad that we protected each other, that we stood up for what was right. That's the kind of man he was, and that's the kind of legacy he leaves behind. As the service concluded and people began to leave, many stopped to offer their support and express their shock at what had unfolded. But the words that meant the most came from Michael as we prepared to leave. "Mom," he said, his voice still shaky but stronger than before, "I'm so sorry. For everything. For not seeing what Jessica really was. For not protecting you better. For almost losing you today." I cupped his face in my hands the way I had when he was a little boy. "You didn't almost lose me, sweetheart. I'm right here and I'm not going anywhere." "I love you, Mom," he said, tears flowing freely down his cheeks. "I love you too," I replied. "And your father loved us both. That's what we need to focus on now." As we walked out of the funeral home together, I thought about the morning's events. I'd woken up as a grieving widow and nearly become a murder victim. But I was ending the day as a survivor, surrounded by people who truly cared about me. Jessica's plan had backfired spectacularly. Instead of eliminating me and inheriting Robert's money, she'd lost everything: her freedom, her family, her future. And I'd gained something I hadn't even realized I'd lost: the knowledge that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. The real healing could finally begin. 6 months later, I stood in the courthouse hallway, waiting for the verdict in Jessica's trial. The marble floors and high ceilings made every whisper echo, but the building felt unusually quiet for a Monday morning. Michael sat beside me on the wooden bench, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He'd aged years in the past 6 months, but there was a strength in his posture that hadn't been there before. "Whatever happens in there," he said quietly, "I want you to know how proud I am of you. Dad would be proud too." I squeezed his hand. "We've all learned things about ourselves we never knew, haven't we?" The trial had been a media sensation. The story of a daughter-in-law trying to murder her mother-in-law for inheritance money had captured public attention in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable. But Detective Williams had assured me that the publicity would work in our favor, making it impossible for Jessica to claim this was all a misunderstanding. The evidence had been overwhelming. The severed brake lines on my car, the bolt cutters found in Jessica's garage with metal filings that matched the composition of my brake components. Most damning of all, the search of her home had uncovered a detailed journal documenting her plans. Page after page of calculations about Robert's and my net worth, timelines for eliminating us both, and backup plans if the initial attempts failed. She'd even researched how long it would take for different types of poison to work, and which ones would be hardest to detect in an autopsy. The journal had revealed the full scope of her plan. After my accident, she intended to comfort Michael in his grief while slowly poisoning him with the same blood thinners she'd been giving Robert. It would look like a genetic condition, a family tendency toward blood clotting disorders. Within a year, she would have been a young widow with 2 small children and a massive inheritance. Dr. Harrison had testified about Robert's mysterious symptoms in his final months. The prosecution's expert witness, a toxicologist, had explained how Jessica had been crushing extra blood thinner tablets and mixing them into Robert's food. The dosage was carefully calculated to weaken him gradually, without causing obvious symptoms that would trigger immediate medical intervention. "She's a patient killer," the prosecutor had said in his closing argument. "She planned these murders for months, maybe years. She studied her victims, learned their routines, and executed a plan designed to eliminate an entire family for financial gain." Jessica's defense attorney had tried to portray her as a loving mother driven to desperation by financial pressures. He'd claimed that her journal was just fantasy, that she'd never actually intended to hurt anyone. But the physical evidence was too strong, and her taped confession in front of 40 witnesses had sealed her fate. The most difficult part of the trial had been listening to Michael testify about their marriage. He'd had to recount years of what he now realized had been manipulation and lies. Jessica had isolated him from friends who might have questioned her behavior. She'd convinced him that I was becoming too dependent on them, that it would be better for everyone if they handled more of my affairs. "She made me feel like I was being a good son by pulling away from my mother," Michael had said on the witness stand, his voice breaking. "She convinced me that setting boundaries was healthy, that Mom needed to learn independence. I see now that she was systematically cutting Mom off from her support system." The jury had been riveted by his testimony. Here was a man who genuinely loved his wife, only to discover that she'd been planning to murder his entire family. During the trial, more details about Jessica's past had emerged. The prosecution had found 2 previous relationships where older partners had died under suspicious circumstances. In both cases, Jessica had inherited money, and in both cases she'd disappeared shortly after the funerals. She'd been much younger then, and the deaths had been attributed to natural causes. But the pattern was unmistakable. Margaret had attended every day of the trial, sitting beside me in the gallery. "That woman is evil," she'd whispered during one particularly damning piece of testimony. "Pure evil." I wasn't sure I believed in pure evil, but I'd come to understand that Jessica was fundamentally different from other people. She lacked empathy, conscience, or genuine emotion. Everything about her was calculated, designed to get what she wanted from the people around her. The children had been the hardest part of this whole ordeal. Michael had gained full custody, and Jessica's parental rights had been terminated. At 8 and 6 years old, Emma and little Bobby were too young to understand why their mother was gone, why Daddy cried sometimes, why everyone looked so sad when her name was mentioned. Michael had found an excellent child psychologist who was helping them process their feelings. Emma, the older one, seemed to be adapting well. She'd always been closer to Michael anyway, and she'd formed a strong bond with me over the past few months. Bobby was more withdrawn, but he was getting better slowly. The courtroom door opened, and the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. My stomach clenched with nerves as we filed back into the courtroom. After 6 months of legal proceedings, it all came down to this moment. Jessica sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked smaller somehow, diminished from the polished woman who'd fooled us all for so many years. As the jury foreman stood to read the verdict, she showed no emotion at all. In the case of the state versus Jessica Lynn Morrison, on the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I nearly collapsed. Michael wrapped his arm around my shoulders as tears streamed down my face. On the charge of murder in the first degree for the death of Robert Patterson, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Jessica's shoulders sagged slightly, but she still showed no real emotion. Even now, even facing life in prison, she seemed incapable of genuine remorse. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following week, but the prosecutor had already told us that Jessica would likely receive life without parole. She would never hurt anyone else ever again. As we left the courthouse, reporters surrounded us, shouting questions and taking pictures. But I felt strangely detached from the chaos. The woman who had tried to destroy my family was going to prison forever. Robert's death had been avenged. Justice had been served. That evening, Michael and I sat in my kitchen sharing a quiet dinner. The house felt peaceful in a way it hadn't since Robert's death. For months, I'd been looking over my shoulder, afraid that Jessica might somehow post bail or find a way to complete her plan. Now that fear was finally gone. "I've been thinking," Michael said as we cleared the dishes, "about selling my house and moving back here with the kids." I looked at him in surprise. "Michael, you don't need to do that. I'm fine on my own." "I know you are," he said. "You've proven that beyond any doubt. But I think we need each other right now. The kids need their grandmother, and honestly, I need my mother." The idea was appealing, but I had concerns. "What about your memories of Jessica there? The life you built together?" Michael's face darkened. "I don't want those memories. I don't want to live in a house where she planned to murder my family. I want to start over somewhere that feels safe and honest." I understood that feeling completely. "Well, this house has plenty of room, and your father always hoped you'd raise your children here someday." "Really?" Michael smiled for the first time in months. "He said that. Many times. He used to talk about building a playground in the backyard, about teaching his grandchildren to fish in the pond behind the house. As we talked about practical arrangements, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Robert's death: hope for the future. The past 6 months had been consumed with trials and testimony, with fear and anxiety about what Jessica might do next. Now we could finally start rebuilding our lives. 2 weeks later, on a crisp autumn Saturday, Michael and the children moved in with me. Emma immediately claimed the bedroom that had been Michael's when he was young, while Bobby chose the smaller room next to mine because he sometimes had nightmares and wanted to be close to Grandma. Watching my grandchildren run through the house that had been so quiet for so long filled my heart with joy. Their laughter echoed in rooms that had known too much sadness, bringing life back to spaces that had felt empty since Robert's death. Emma found Robert's old fishing gear in the garage and begged Michael to teach her how to use it. "Grandpa would have wanted me to learn," she said with the confident logic of an 8-year-old. Michael's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded. "You're absolutely right. He would have loved teaching you." As I watched my son and granddaughter head down to the pond with Robert's old fishing poles, I felt his presence more strongly than I had since the funeral. This was what he would have wanted: his family together, his grandchildren growing up in the house he'd built with his own hands, his memory living on in their stories and traditions. Bobby came up beside me, slipping his small hand into mine. "Grandma, Daddy says Mommy can't come home anymore." The question I'd been dreading finally came. I knelt down to his level, looking into eyes that were so much like Michael's at that age. "That's right, sweetheart. Mommy made some very bad choices. And now she has to stay in a place where she can't hurt anyone." "Did she hurt you?" he asked, with the directness that only children possess. "She tried to," I said honestly. "But I'm okay now, and you're safe, and Daddy's safe. That's what matters." Bobby nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Can you teach me to make cookies like you taught Emma?" "Of course I can," I said, scooping him up in a hug. "Your grandpa loved my chocolate chip cookies. I think he'd want you to learn the recipe too." That evening, as the children slept in their new rooms and Michael worked late in his old bedroom setting up his home office, I sat on the front porch with a cup of tea. The autumn air was crisp, and the stars were clearer than they'd been in months. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been a terrified widow who'd discovered her daughter-in-law was trying to kill her. I'd felt powerless, isolated, afraid for my life. Now, I was a survivor who'd found her voice and used it to protect not just herself, but her entire family. I'd learned that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, that I could face down evil and emerge victorious. Jessica had wanted to eliminate me because she saw me as an obstacle to her plans. She'd viewed me as a weak old woman who could be easily disposed of. But she'd underestimated something fundamental about me. I was a mother and grandmother who would do anything to protect the people I loved. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "How's the first night going?" I typed back, "Perfect. Absolutely perfect." And it was. The house felt alive again, filled with the sounds of family life that had been missing for too long. Robert's spirit seemed to permeate every room, not with sadness, but with the joy of seeing his family together and safe. As I prepared to go inside, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the frightened widow who'd overheard that terrible phone conversation 6 months ago. This woman had steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. This woman had faced down a killer and won. "Thank you, Robert," I whispered to the night air, "for warning me, for protecting me even after you were gone, for giving me the strength to fight back." The wind rustled through the trees, and for just a moment I could swear I felt his presence beside me, proud and protective as always. I was 68 years old, and I was finally free. Free from fear, free from Jessica's manipulations, free to build the future I wanted with the family I loved. The next chapter of my life was just beginning, and for the first time since Robert's death, I was genuinely excited to see what it would bring.